This project is about Venezuela's large-scale refugee crisis currently causing millions of Venezuelans to suffer every day.
Venezuela is located on the north end of South America. Its neighboring countries are Brazil, Colombia, and Guyana. Venezuela has many mountain ranges, coastal towns, offshore islands, and the Amazon rainforest. Venezuela has a hot and humid tropical climate, which is more moderate in the highlands. Caracas, the capital, has a tropical savanna climate. The crisis in Venezuela has forced 6 million refugees to flee into neighboring countries. The crisis has put many people at risk: disabled people, elderly, children, and pregnant women in particular. People who leave Venezuela flee from violence, food insecurity, and the lack of medicine and essential services.
The height of the COVID-19 pandemic has worsened the refugee crisis and has decreased the amounts of necessities that were already at dangerous lows. Many are at risk for eviction and are in other dangerous positions. Venezuelans are very vulnerable to human traffickers and smugglers and fall prey to them when crossing the border. Up to December 2021, more than 6.05 million Venezuelans have fled.
The crisis was heightened because of a large conflict with the leaders of the country. Nicolas Maduro won a presidential election many people believed to be fraudulent, but Juan Guaido, who is the leader of the National Assembly, proclaimed himself as president on January 23, 2019, using a constitutional provision to do so. While there are efforts to recognize Guaido as the legitimate president, and they are widespread, as the United States and 50 other democratic nations recognize him as the rightful president, Maduro still heavily controls Venezuela and is backed by autocratic nations like China and Russia.
Maduro's Socialist Party has remained supreme, which is the cause and the belief of many for the refugee crisis. 50% of children under 5 show signs of malnutrition, and about 280,000 are currently at the risk of dying due to the malnourishment. The fighting between Colombian and Venezuelan armies have displaced many Venezuelans, and the ongoing issue is continuing to intensify, as the Venezuelan government was recently accused by a human rights activist group to be working with the Colombian rebel groups due to the conflict between Venezuela and Colombia.
These conflicts have been going on since early 2022. There's been a lot of clashing between different armed groups at the border of Colombia and Venezuela. According to Human Rights Watch, on January 1st, 2022, clashes broke out between the Joint Eastern Command, a coalition of dissident groups that emerged from the demobilized Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, and the National Liberation Army guerrillas, over the control and territory and illegal activities in Colombia's Arauca state and Venezuela's Apure state.
The first demographic we are looking at is children. They are the youngest refugees that have to flee, leaving their school and education behind. They have no idea when they can go back to school and get the education they were robbed of when escaping the violence. For all the kids who are migrating, their brains are still developing. 50% of children under 5 show signs of malnutrition, and about 280,000 are currently at risk of dying because of malnourishment. These factors make it very difficult for them to go back into society. They also face xenophobia, which could make it difficult for them to go to school.
The second demographic we focused on is women. Venezuelan women are suffering especially during the crisis due to a lack of supplies they find essential. They are not treated with the respect they deserve and are particularly vulnerable because of this. Feminine products are extremely difficult to find. Women are excluded from political decisions that affect them and their well-being, including the distribution of their necessities. Women are also put in difficult positions to find work during this economic crisis. In 2020, Venezuela got an 0.71 on the Gender Gap Index, which means women are 29% less likely to have equal opportunities in schooling, work, and politics. Venezuela's score is also dropping in the Gender Gap Index, and it has dropped by 3 points since 2018, meaning women are increasingly having less opportunities in schooling, work, and politics. In 2020, the percent of female homicides increased by 50% from the year before, even though the country's population is decreasing. In 2021, 34 women were reportedly killed due to domestic violence. They also often fall prey to human traffickers at the borders and are exploited. Pregnant women are especially vulnerable to these traffickers.
The second to last demographic we're going to be looking at are the elderly people of Venezuela. A study conducted by Convoy found that 77% of older Venezuelans claimed they couldn't get enough food and were often malnourished. This is because most elderly people in Venezuela have worked low-income jobs their whole life and were unable to save for retirement, so they're forced to keep working just to stay afloat. But Venezuela, having their hunger and prescription shortages, as well as a collapsing public health system, leaves a lot of elderly people with only one option, which is to join the 4.5 million Venezuelan refugees around the world. However, it is not easy for them to immigrate because of the health challenges that come with old age, so sadly, a lot of them end up dying while fleeing. It's truly a tragedy, and at the moment, there's no end in sight to this issue.
The final demographic we're going to look at are the young men. Just like all the other demographics, they're struggling, but not always in the same way. From what we did learn, a lot of young men get left to stay behind in Venezuela, or they can flee by themselves. The ones who do stay are often harassed by guerrilla groups. Guerrilla groups are groups that fight against the government. There are many different organizations providing shelter and resources to help the men who do flee. The young men's journey and experiences are different from the children and women's because they are usually alone, and children and women usually flee together. Lots of the young men coming into neighboring countries were interviewed. When they were interviewed, a lot more of them were educated compared to the elderly, children, and women. Educated young men have been able to find skilled jobs, but those who don't have the same education struggle to find work. In my opinion, the organization should focus on making a program to help refugees find work who are uneducated or unskilled. So much of the refugee experience varies depending on where you go and how you decide to get there, but men do usually go alone.
In conclusion, we found that all Venezuelans are suffering because of the internal crisis, but we can help. There are many organizations we can donate to, like groups listed on the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees website. Also, as we are doing, we need to continue to raise awareness and understanding about these issues, and we need to create empathy and attention for all of the refugees suffering around the world. This project was made by Ellis, Lynch, Gianni, Testa, Jameson, Wells, and Miles Blanchard.